I was really disconnected from the real world and my real life. As that course progressed kind of day by day, my belief in the magic got more intense. My sense of reality got kind of more and more unmoored. By the middle of the week, I was hearing voices in my head and thought that was a very positive and natural consequence of the work I was doing. By the final day of the course, my mind completely fractured and fell apart. And so I ended up in a psychiatric ward.
Welcome to Character Study, the podcast that explores how artists shape their lives and work. This week's guest is Hannah Murray. Here's 3 things you should know about Hannah. 1. Hannah started her acting career playing Cassie in Skins, then later joined the Game of Thrones cast as Gilly. She's a talented actor and has worked on films depicting shocking real-life events, such as Detroit, directed by Catherine Bigelow, about the 1967 Detroit riots, Bridgend, about the Bridgend suicides of South Wales, and Charlie Says, about the women manipulated by the Manson cult. 2. Hannah took time away from the industry to complete a degree in English literature at Cambridge, then did a creative writing master's at UEA. 3. Hannah became involved in a wellness organisation, which led to a breakdown and her being confined in a psychiatric ward. She's written about her experience in her memoir, The Make-Believe, which is about fame, mental illness, and how the line between magic and reality can blur, then disappear. I've loved seeing all the book promo. Everything looks like it's going so well. How's it been?
It's been sort of amazing. Yeah, sort of terrifyingly amazing in a way where it's like, is this actually happening? I'm really thrilled.
So exciting to talk to you about your book. I've got so many things I want to ask. It was a really special experience reading it. I kind of had one of those moments where in the prologue, which is just so lyrical and poetic, I kind of sat up straight like, wow, this is a really special writer. Your writing is so raw. It has such an immediacy to it. And I just wanted to know for you, like on this book tour, what it's been like for you sharing something with the world that's been writing rather than acting.
It honestly feels like 1,000 times cooler to share something. I was thinking about, this is a very weird deep cut reference, but Anna Paquin won an Oscar when she was like 10 years old for the piano. And then she won, I think, a Golden Globe for True Blood when she was an adult. And they were like, which is cooler? And she was like, this is so much cooler because I'm like a proper human now. And it's something I feel like I've actually know what I'm doing and I've achieved a different kind of thing. And I feel not quite the same, but I guess I feel like there was always something with acting of like, it's not your words, it's not your voice, and it's not your creative vision. And so to make something of my own that is in my own words, that is in my voice, and that is to express such a personal experience, it's a totally different animal, I think.
In that kind of Anna Paquin reference, you're saying like, oh, and I'm a real human now, and I suppose we all go on that journey. And reading this book, it feels like you're really in a place where you know yourself. There's so much warmth and perspective as you're looking back. And I'm interested, like, for you kind of thinking about your own character journey, how do you feel that you're more now knowing who you are? I suppose as being an actor, we just place so much, or with anything that we do, so much focus on who we are. We define by what we do. And I wonder if that was a big thing for you as you were acting, putting so much focus on being an actor and your roles. And it feels like as you're writing this book, you really know who you are in a different way that goes a lot deeper than just the external stuff.
I think there's something about kind of just about growing up that you always feel like you're way more grown up in the moment. And then time passes and you look back and you realize I was a baby. And so I think, like, if I think back to how I felt in my 20s, I thought I had a really clear sense of self and I knew who I was. And I think who I was then was an actor. That was kind of how I primarily defined myself. And so moving careers essentially was a really hard sort of identity shift. And now I sort of wonder, why does my identity have to be predicated on my job? I mean, obviously, when you have a creative job, it can feel like much more than just a job, and it can feel like your whole it's your passion, it's how you spend most of your days, and you're kind of obsessed by it. It's almost funny to me, the sense of certainty we have at different stages about who we are. And now I'm more comfortable with the fact that will probably continue to evolve over time.
Definitely. I think when we're young, we place so much focus on this idea of who we will be and these creative trappings, or also these labels, because I think we think, oh, well, that's someone I want to be. And so if I'm that, then I will feel a certain way and I'll be happy. And in the beginning of your book, you talk about that a lot, getting this amazing role in the film Detroit. And you write, well, once I get this job, everything will be better and I won't feel like this anymore. And I relate to that so much, of just thinking, if I get this thing, then everything will be fixed, and constantly the goalposts are moving and moving. Tell me about your emotional landscape when we meet you in the beginning of the make-believe.
I mean, I think at the beginning of this journey that I went on, I was just looking for the thing that would fix everything. And whether I was thinking that might be an acting role, whether I thought that might be a relationship, whether I thought that might ultimately be a sort of magical experience. It was always like I didn't feel okay. I didn't feel well a lot of the time. And I thought something has to come along to transform me and make everything okay. And it was always something outside of myself, I guess, that I was looking for in that search. And then what was really hard was when something that seemed like it was exactly that, like the role in Detroit, was just like everything I'd ever wanted, with this like Oscar-winning director and kind of dream opportunity. And then almost immediately I crashed into a really severe depression, and I couldn't understand why I couldn't feel happy in that moment, even just a few days after I'd got this incredible piece of news. And that was a real like, oh, maybe there's something really wrong with me if the thing that was supposed to fix it hasn't fixed it.
You articulate all of those feelings that are so complex, and also I think so relatable, so well in the book. Like looking for this external thing to fix something really internal. Your writing about romance just moved me and broke my heart so much.
Oh, thank you.
I think you write a lot about this relationship that you have with this person, Sam, and I won't spoil it for anybody who's going to read the book, but I think so much of us have all this hope that gets put into relationships, and they can feel so devastating beyond what's actually happened. Like there are some scenes, where you're drunk at a party trying to talk to a friend about it, and we've all been there where we've been the drunk person who can't stop talking about this relationship.
Yeah.
Where on the surface, like not much has happened, but also everything has happened. I'm also, I feel like, quite an imaginative person, and I find the beginning of relationships so hard because so much is going on in my head. There's all these stories that I've created. There's this whole world and future relationship that the other person hasn't really even been part of.
No.
So I feel like for you capture that so much of being an imaginative person, and the gap between what's going on in your head and the reality of what's happening is just such a big gulf.
It really is. And I think there's one of the epigraphs I use in the book is from a Sylvia Plath poem. And I use a few lines from it, but the final line is, "I think I made you up inside my head." And the poem's called Mad Girl's Love Song. And I just remember I first wrote that poem as a teenager, and I just felt like that's what happens when you fall for someone. You like, on the one hand, you're like, well, they're so perfect and they're so wonderful, and I must have invented them, because how can someone be this incredible? And then on the other hand, you're like, are they even real, or have I invented them? And I just think, yeah, we do so much imaginative labor when we start to form an attraction to someone else, and often create entire futures with them that, as you say, they have no idea that's going on in our minds. And I feel like you can even get like angry with someone for an argument you've imagined that hasn't happened yet, or like all kinds of things can happen in your head that aren't real. And I think there's something really interesting and maybe quite beautiful and also quite sad about that, and that it actually creates distance to the very person you want to be closest to.
That's such a good line to remember from this. I remember also reading that when I was young, and I think sometimes when you go, as you get older, these lines and quotes of things that have really resonated with you then take on different meanings. I remember after like a couple months stopping to see someone that we'd had like what I felt like was a really amazing connection and lots of time apart, which really made the whole thing more romantic to me. And I remember speaking on the phone as we were kind of saying we weren't going to see each other more and saying, oh, well, I feel like, I need some closure from this. I need to understand why. And him going, closure, like we've barely, what are you talking about? And feeling like really such a victim of that because I'd made everything in my head. But actually, I think as I've got older, I've realized that sometimes those tendencies as well, it's not good for the other person because I'm not always seeing who they actually are because I'm creating so many stories that I'm not really seeing who that person is. So there can be like both the side that's hard for you when you're a very imaginative romantic, but also the side that's really hard for them when they're trying to show you who they are.
Yeah, completely. I think it's quite an unfair thing to do to someone, really, to put them on a pedestal, to imagine futures about them, and also to, imagine a version of them that is kind of too good to be true. No one is that. And so you probably aren't seeing the reality of them or letting them be themselves in your eyes, really.
I think it's a lot to ask someone of this hope for romance that becomes a container for, well, if I have a happy future with this person, then I'll have a happy future in general. And if this person sees me as lovable, then maybe I'll finally feel like I'm lovable.
Yeah. Whereas actually I don't think there's anything in life that can like inoculate you against future pain. That's just not how life works or how the world works. What I found when I started telling this story, I didn't know this Sam relationship was necessarily going to be an element in the book. I was just writing about a specific time in my life, and then I kind of tried to put everything down that was happening then. And as I started writing about that relationship or that kind of obsession that I had with him at the time, I realized that it was a very similar impulse to the other things I was seeking out. I was always seeking something outside of myself, whether that was through like cigarettes or alcohol or drugs or then this kind of spiritual wellness journey that I went on. I never believed that I contained enough to fix me on my own.
And what you capture so beautifully as well is that feeling of being surrounded by people, having everything go well on the outside, being very busy, but feeling very lonely on the inside. And I think lots of us in our 20s where we don't quite know our path or feel a sense of quote unquote well-being, that is how we feel, lonely, and I want to connect to something bigger than ourselves. And those are the kind of beginnings of then looking for answers or looking for some connection to something bigger that then led you on this journey. So tell me a little bit about going to meet this healer, Grace, that kind of becomes like the catalyst for your experience.
So I got this part in Detroit in this Catherine Bigelow film, and I was filming it in Boston, and I was having the most incredible experience. I was so happy every day, and I loved the cast and I loved the crew, but the film is about the Detroit uprising, and it's about police brutality, and it was some very, very difficult scenes to film, and one in particular really shook me up and kind of traumatized me, I suppose. And I kept telling myself, well, this didn't really happen, I just acted in a scene. But my body knew that something was wrong. My body felt like something was wrong. And I was seeing a personal trainer at the time in Boston, and she said, I know this energy healer, and maybe, I don't know if you're into that kind of thing, but maybe that would help shift some of this stuff for you. And I had started to kind of get into meditation and spirituality and was kind of exploring that and feeling like I was having a little bit of an awakening with all that kind of stuff. So I was really keen to try this out. And then it was a much more kind of life-changing experience than I ever could have anticipated.
There's a lot of power in a recommendation that comes from a person that you really trust, isn't there? I think, you can identify as somebody, oh, I'm not really that into woo stuff, or I'm not really into spiritual stuff. But I know you were reading a lot of self-help books, looking for different answers, trying meditation. And then when someone you trust or a friend says, I think you'd really like this person, it kind of opens you up to something new that you might not try otherwise.
For sure. And I think it felt like it was kind of because I think that wellness can be quite a big umbrella. And so sort of exercise and fitness, I guess she felt like it was an extension of that to explore energy healing. And I do think it was, I think she meant well. I think it was a very innocent suggestion. I think if she had known what was going to happen to me, she would never have suggested I go and see this woman. It was such a profound experience for me, and it left me believing in magic, which was something I had always wanted to believe in, always wanted to be real. And then suddenly it kind of was. So I left, I went into this woman's apartment and left completely transformed by the experience, I suppose.
One of the things that really stayed with me from the book was about your experience when you were younger, when you just turned 11 and you were devastated that you had been invited to Hogwarts. And I felt for you so much in that moment, but think it really captures how much you've always wanted to believe in magic. And I think we all do, right, on some level. And that was what you experienced, was like real life magic, basically what it felt like.
Yeah, I think there's something, I assume we're maybe a sort of similar sort of age. I think that people that grew up with the Harry Potter books coming out every few years and that being this huge event, particularly if you started reading them before the age of 11, I know I was not the only person who thought, well, when on my 11th birthday, I'm going to get an owl arrive at my house and my whole life is going to change and I'm going to go to wizard school. But I think whatever generation you're from, there are these stories we're told as children about magic. We all kind of consume a lot of narratives about otherworldly things being possible, and often in that way where it's just beneath the surface of the world that we know. It feels like very possible that you could break through that barrier and suddenly things you never conceived of as being possible are possible. And so that was what it felt like to me when I had that healing. I thought, it's always been here and I've finally discovered it. I've finally been able to access it. And I just thought, this is what I've always wanted, and now it's here.
And also the stories that are connected to that. I think why we love things like Harry Potter or anything magical is that it's about someone who's normal or a child or someone who's maybe a little bit doubted in life that suddenly finds this inner strength and resource. And it's a very powerful hero story about somebody that has perception, imagination, kindness, is suddenly able to access something bigger than themselves. And that's such an attractive story to believe on some way that we're special, but also that we're special because of our sensitivity.
I think that's really true. And I think there's something in a lot of these, kind of hero narratives, particularly the kind of chosen one narratives, which Harry Potter very much is. And I was really obsessed with Buffy the Vampire Slayer as well, of like, it's someone who's a bit weird and different and kind of ostracized often from their kind of their peer group. And then it turns out that they're not weird, they're special. And they're the answer to the kind of, they're going to save the world, save the universe, save humanity, whatever it is. And I think that's incredibly seductive, because who doesn't want to be special, particularly if life has made you maybe feel like you're not special or you're an outsider. Then it's like, well, maybe I'm like those people in the stories, and one day everyone will realize that I was brilliant and that they should have paid more attention to me, I suppose.
Is that how you felt at that time in your life?
I think there was definitely something, and this kind of emerged for me through the process of writing the book. I realized how much acting for me had been about wanting to feel special and chosen, because I got offered my first professional role when I was still a teenager, when I was still at school, and I wasn't popular at school. I didn't have many friends, and I dressed in a very weird way and people didn't seem to like that. And I felt like a kind of outsider. And then suddenly this TV thing came along and they were like, we want you and we like the way you dress and we like that you're weird and we want to kind of, that's why you're being chosen, is because of all the things that are unique about you. And that feeling was so transformative and then became really addictive. To sustain an acting career, you have to keep being chosen. And you have to keep getting told you're special. But a lot of the time you get told the very opposite. You get told, well, we didn't pick you. And then you feel like, well, what's wrong with me? And I'm not special. And so I think, there was this kind of very difficult cycle I was trapped in of highs and lows, of never knowing when I would be chosen, knowing that it would probably happen within say at least once a year, hopefully, if I was lucky, but needing that rush of they picked me, I'm the one. over and over again. And I guess that also links back to romance as well, right? If you want to be picked, but you see this other person as very special, and if they pick you, that means you're maybe worthy or special like they are.
And all of that has to be so grounded in hope, because to be able to go out on a date, to be able to go on an audition or to write a book, whatever it is, you have to have a fundamental belief in you of like, no, this is the right thing to do and I will be chosen. Otherwise, so trying to put yourself in that mindset while still getting knocked back is really tough. And I think for any of us that, well, whatever we do, especially if it's creative, it is really important to be curious about our own relationship with external validation. I think about that a lot of like, what does this need in me, not just to write, but also to accept that I do want it to do well. I do want people to say nice things about it. Where does it come from? And how can I realize when that's not helpful for me and when to step back? It sounds like you have that now, but that's very hard to do when you're in your early 20s. And also you're not necessarily like aware of the patterns, the cycles that you're stuck in.
Totally. I think it's probably, I'm not sure I want to meet the person who's able to do that in their early 20s. Like someone that's that kind of, got their shit sorted out that young, I'd find them kind of terrifying. Yeah, I think it's a really difficult thing, and it felt particularly true of acting, but maybe is true of lots of other things too. But that need to be sort of tough and sort of thick-skinned to be able to handle the rejection. But if you're too tough and thick-skinned, you probably can't do the work, because you need to be sensitive, you need to be vulnerable, you need to have this access to your emotions in order to, if you do get a part, do it well. And I think that strange kind of tension between the two of like, how can I be strong enough to handle all these knockbacks and yet be as vulnerable as I need to be to do the work. That always felt like a real struggle, because it could really harden you, I think. You'd be like, well, I'm never going to hope for anything ever again. But you have to hope, or you wouldn't go into an audition room and you wouldn't go on a date. And as you say, like, so it's always a tension, I think, between allowing the possibility of hope, but not letting the rejections destroy your hope, your capacity for it.
In your book, I'd not really thought too much about actually what is required in that way of being an actor. And you write so well about the way that you have to be so raw and open and like to enable this authenticity to kind of flow through you. You've described it at one point as it's almost like a shamanic process, especially for something like Detroit, where you're trying to embody not just a fictional person, but like a real person. And so I think we then so understand what follows in the book of how open you had to be to like channeling energy, visions, process. Tell me a little bit about like after this energy healing that you had with Grace, the process to meeting this like wider organization and what you can tell me about them.
Yeah, so Grace sort of offered, what she kind of sold to me was almost like a package. It was like, there's this incredible healing that will change your life and like make you truly authentic to who you are and strip away anything that isn't serving you and all that kind of stuff. And she said, and then there's a 2-day class that you can take that sort of follows on from that will give you tools to heal yourself that you can use in your day-to-day life. And she suggested I could take it in Boston, but I was about to leave Boston at the point that I met her. And she said, oh, that's no problem. You can take it in London as well, which sort of surprised me, because I had thought this is just this tiny little thing with like one woman is running it. And then I started to get a sense that it was something a little bit bigger, but still thought it was very small. And so when I came back to London, I took this class with a different woman who I call Siobhan in the book. I guess, yeah, it just kept kind of escalating and escalating. And at each step, I was only shown kind of the next step. But then I'd get to the end of like the 2-day class and it was like, well, then there's more courses you can take. And there's a path that kind of takes you further and further and further. And you'll become more and more evolved as a human being. And so, yeah, in this class, I learned a series of rituals that I was supposed to perform twice a day at home, and that I did perform twice a day at home. I was very dedicated to them and very diligent, because they also felt magical in a real way to me. I mean, I was the big thing I experienced in the healing with Grace was a kind of sense of an invisible force moving my body, which was the big transformative thing that made me think, well, magic must be real. And I could feel those same sensations when I was performing the rituals in a slightly subtler way, but I could feel some kind of energy moving out of my fingertips. I could feel the whole kind of air in the room after I performed the rituals felt different to me. And so I was completely hooked because it felt so real. And then about 5 or 6 months after I'd taken the class, which was 2 days, I signed up for a week-long course, which was to learn how to perform the healing that Grace had originally performed on me.
It's incredibly powerful, the writing in the book about the visions that you had and the sensation of being able to perform both this healing on people and for you. I suppose it was then you feeling like you were the chosen one again, because it sounds like you were very good at it and you were very sensitive to the magic. I can kind of imagine you doing these always like dances as you were like choreographing these healings on people. It sounds like it must have been incredibly addictive.
It felt absolutely amazing. And yeah, it did feel like a dance. When I started performing the healings myself, I felt like in my body this sense of like, this is what I was put on this earth to do, because it felt so natural to me and so right and so kind of effortless. And the teachers were telling me I was really good at it, and they were telling me they loved watching me give the healings. And I started to feel, I did start to feel like I'm special. I'm extra good at this. Maybe I have like great spiritual powers that I need to give to the world. But I think now with more hindsight, I think part of the reason I was good at it was because I was an actor. And I was very good at investing in that kind of imaginative work to make it feel as real as it possibly could. So I had a kind of slightly unfair advantage compared to the other students because I was used to believing in things that weren't actually there.
Yeah, you write about whether asking, was I coming up with the visions or were the visions coming to me? And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because how do you ever know? I actually a friend had recommended to me to go to this kind of similar event retreat thing called the Temple of the Womb. And I was firstly, it came from somebody I trusted. And also I was really looking for something that would help align me in some kind of spiritual way to make things I was going through make sense, to shift energy. Also, as a writer, I kind of thought, well, why not? If it's weird, it'll be an interesting story. So why not?
Yeah.
And then suddenly when I was surrounded by these other people who were clearly feeling very physically and emotionally moved by the guided meditations and the dances and the potions, I had this feeling of like, oh, well, maybe it's me that's not getting it. And also I want to be as good at this as other people. And I did end up through the guided meditation having some kind of vision, something. But was that me going with it and coming up with it? Was it something else? I don't know. But I was really surprised by the power of being surrounded by other people who were really investing in being together in that same moment. Like, that's very powerful. And you were with a cohort of other people, right? So that must have been exceptionally powerful and also very addictive to be in that moment with these people.
Yeah, there's definitely something about the group experience of it, that if you're in a room where everyone believes the same things, it's much easier to surrender to believing them than to hold yourself back and kind of be skeptical or be questioning. And I can really relate to what you're saying about, like, I want to be good at this. Like, I want to be a kind of good student. And if they're telling me I'm going to see visions, then I better start seeing them. And because I remember even in the moment kind of wondering, I was always wondering until a certain point when I just kind of, everything became kind of overwhelmingly magical to me. In the early stages, in particular that first class, I was really questioning, am I doing this right? Am I forcing it? Is it real? Is it not real? But it was always, I thought if it wasn't real, it was my fault. I was the problem. So I had to kind of, be as good at it as I could possibly be, whilst always kind of doubting if I was overthinking it, if overthinking it meant I wasn't doing it right, and all those kind of questions.
Yeah, because we're all asking, am I not doing it right? It must be my fault. I wonder if that's like some kind of good girl complex we all have. But also, Of course, we would want that to be right. We're all so much in life searching for something that can give us clarity in the mystery that is the world, give us answers to the pain that we have to go through. That's just an essential part of the human condition. And the idea of then magic or spiritualism is so attractive. So although on the outside, many of us might say like, oh, I don't believe in that kind of stuff. And we all start that way. Suddenly when you're in a room full of people and you're thinking, oh, maybe I can tap into something here. I'm also really interested that the guided meditations you went through focused a lot on like earth, fire, water, because I think that is also ingrained in who we are deeply as people and the natural human experience of the earth. That I think is very powerful, because that was the same for me. Suddenly when you're being asked to tap into something very natural,
Yeah.
that really does help your imagination. It's amazing what you can then suddenly conjure up.
I hadn't quite ever thought of it in those terms, but yeah, those like, yeah, earth, water, fire, and air are so like viscerally sensory. And so if you're told like sense the element of air, sense the element of fire, you have so many memories of what that feels like to draw on. And I was always overwhelmed by how kind of profoundly I could experience these elemental energies, but maybe most people can because we know them, because they're the basic building blocks of our world.
And suddenly you're kind of going through this journey for you where it's like, okay, well, maybe if I can be addicted to like relationships and cigarettes and alcohol, maybe I can be addicted to something good. Maybe I can be addicted to meditation and I'll be fixed. Is that kind of how you felt on this journey? Like, I can fix myself through doing this. If I do everything right, if I do these spells, these rituals. Tell me about how that kind of went from an intent to be well to something that really unraveled.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought, because I was struggling with these various addictions in my 20s, that I sort of, it seemed much easier to replace them with something than to just get rid of them. So it was, and I'd read a self-help book that had kind of advocated for, if you have an addictive personality, you can get addicted to meditation instead, or like gratitude rituals or forgiveness practices. Like you can just switch that mechanism to be addicted to positive things. And that really resonated with me. So I thought, that's great. And then I very quickly was addicted to this organization's practices. And I think really it was when I committed to doing this week-long course, I stayed away from, I lived in London and the course was in London, but I stayed in an Airbnb very close to where it was taking place because I wanted to immerse myself in it as much as possible. I didn't tell anyone I was going to be where I really was. Like I told my flatmate I was staying with my parents. My parents thought I was still with my flatmate. And so I was really disconnected from the real world and my real life. And as that course progressed kind of day by day, my belief in the magic got more intense. My sense of reality got kind of more and more unmoored. And by the middle of the week, I was hearing voices in my head and thought that was a very positive and natural consequence of the work I was doing. And then by the final day of the course, my mind completely fractured and fell apart. And so I ended up in a psychiatric ward, which for 3 weeks. And it took much longer than the 3 weeks to really rebuild my relationship with reality and to shake that belief system.
Hello, it's me, Freya. Just letting you know that you can now pre-order my debut novel, A Real Piece of Work. It's a book about sisters, complicated families, and what happens to grief when it becomes a collective experience. I really wanted to explore who owns grief, who gets to tell the story of those who are gone. It's also a family comedy, so I hope it makes you laugh. You can pre-order A Real Piece of Work wherever you get your books, and I'm really excited that if you buy it from Foyles, you'll receive a limited edition cotton bandana while stocks last. If you prefer to listen to your books, it's also available as an audiobook. Happy reading. And because that was being validated by the people around you who were saying, yeah, your connection is so powerful, that of course this makes sense.
Yeah. And particularly the voices thing, I was told before I started to hear them that we would start to hear voices and that was a positive thing. And then later when I was sort of questioning the leader of the organization, whose voice was one of the voices I believed I had heard in my head, I said, was that real? And he said, yes, that's accurate. I spoke to you in your mind. So there was a lot of validation from them that these things that really now I see as a consequence of a mental breakdown were all positive signs of the magic working.
And one of the things that comes from writing a memoir, of course, is the like connection that you have with other people, the way it heals other people who've had similar experiences or feel seen by it. But also I don't know if you feel that I kind of don't like the word healing because it's too simplistic, but I suppose that there's a lot that we gain about how we view ourselves when we write a memoir. And I wrote a book about my life after my brother died. And one of the things that was so powerful for me was I'd had a huge amount of self-blame of the ways that I coped when I was in my 20s with drinking and going out and being busy and dating the wrong people. And then suddenly when I'm writing it and you're going through it, it's like, oh my God, of course this character would cope in these ways. Of course they would end up where they are. Of course. And it enabled me to access a level of self-compassion that I hadn't really been able to have up until that point. How did you find the process of writing this book and your relationship with like what you went through and the ways you searched to cope?
I mean, writing the book was the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And I'm quite wary of the word healing as well, partly because of the context of the experiences I had. But I think if it helped with my recovery, maybe is what I would prefer to say. But it's funny because people always ask when you say you've written a memoir, like, was it cathartic? I feel like everyone has this idea in their head that like that's the appropriate word. And of course it is, especially in the early stages where you're just kind of splurging stuff onto the page. It does feel cathartic. But ultimately, I mean, I wrote this book over 7 years and really it started to feel much more empowering than anything else. And I felt like being able to really carefully choose exactly how I wanted to describe these experiences and put it into my own words was a real reclamation of what had happened to me. And I can really relate to what you're saying about the empathy you have. Like it gives you a certain degree of distance to look at what you went through.
Yeah.
And you can then hold that version of you from the past in a completely different and much kinder way, I think.
I love that word, reclamation. Yeah, cathartic is another one. People love to put that into it.
Cathartic, brave, yeah.
Brave, raw. Yeah. Some of the writing that I find moved me the most is you're writing about your parents. You really well capture this idea of like feeling a very real fracture from them in your relationship, but everybody looking to place on you some big event that happened that you feel that way and not wanting to give you space to just feel not connected to them. And I think it's very hard to write about family. And I'd love to know your perspective on, how much you felt you were battling with what of this can I share and what belongs to me as my relationship and how will they feel about it?
I found writing about my parents was some of the hardest stuff to write, partly because I think I still felt guilty for not having a perfect relationship with them when I couldn't point to some kind of gigantic problem that had caused that distance between us at that time in my life. Like I think it's impossible to write memoir in a completely ethical way because you can say, I just want to tell my story and I'm just going to write about my experiences, but those things don't happen in a vacuum. And so you end up writing about other people and you end up writing about things that maybe are as much theirs as yours, if not even more theirs than yours sometimes. And I think ultimately I just felt like I had to be really honest about where I was at that time in my life and the things that may have contributed to what happened to me. And I thought if I kind of cut my parents out of this, it won't be a true depiction of that time and that story really. So I guess it almost felt like a confession that I had such negative feelings about them and our relationship in my 20s.
It's so beautiful, and I really commend you for writing it. It's so brave. No, it's but I think also it's so important to read things like that for people. That's the kind of trade-off. I think it's always thinking, will this hurt somebody, but also will this help somebody? And I got very much in a trap, having written about my family in my first book, feeling like, well, maybe it will be worth it if this really helps people. And I got a bit, that was very unhelpful for me, thinking like, if this book does well enough, I'll be redeemed. But until then I will have just done this awful thing. And that can be like a really difficult spiral. But even if it just connects with one person, and also thinking about yourself, well, if I've written the most honest version of this and been true in my heart with how I've depicted it, then maybe that will be okay. Maybe that's really the important thing to come from it. Because there's a huge amount of love in the writing for you and your parents, of the commitment to each other, the ways that you show up or try and communicate over the book. There's something very honest in that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I spent a lot of time asking myself those questions of like, how many people does this have to help to make it okay that I've done this and to make me a kind of good person as well as a good writer. And I think ultimately what it came down to for me was actually there were points during the writing process where I was still really struggling with what had happened to me and was struggling with a lot of very deep, dark, depressive periods. And I couldn't write during those times. And I could barely get out of bed. And sometimes I wanted to give up on the whole idea of writing the book. And then I really didn't want to get out of bed. And I sort of thought, I need to write this even if I'm the only person that it helps.
Yes, yeah.
I really need to tell this story and get it out there for my own sake. Because it started to feel almost like the main reason I had to keep going was to tell this story. And so that was how I stopped feeling guilty about whether it was okay to do so or not, I guess.
Yeah. One of the things I always think is quite interesting as well is, I think as a writer, if you write something and put it out into the world, there's a lot of, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. That must be so hard for the people around you. But I'm also really interested in families, like all the ways we're kind of all writers. We're all putting stories on each other, narratives on each other, especially as parents. We hand down stories to people. I'm really interested what you write about with your mum talking about her miscarriages and the huge impact that had on you and your life. Because I think that's interesting that that's a narrative that you've been given that you pick up. So it's kind of story in a different way. Tell me a little bit about how you felt that was a really big story in your life that changed who you were.
So I write about this in the book that my mum had 5 miscarriages before I was born. So it was it was a really difficult process for them to have a child and to have me. And I was aware of this from quite a young age. I don't actually remember the first time I was ever told this. I kind of don't ever remember really being conscious without knowing this story. And the story sort of was, I had 5 miscarriages. I was the most miserable I'd ever been in my life. And then you came along and you were wonderful and you were perfect. And then everything was wonderful. And at quite a young age, I started to have these big existential questions about that, of like, well, what is that? Who were those other babies that weren't born? Could they have been born? Would they have been me? Would they have been different from me? What would my life have been like if they had been born and I had siblings? Would I have ever been born if they had been born? All these kind of questions I was wrestling with. And I started to realize in my 20s, kind of through some therapy. And I think therapy is an interesting example because that's also storytelling, really, of we impose a narrative on what's happened to us to help us understand it better, I think was kind of how I now see that. I felt incredibly guilty for sort of being alive. And I felt like I had this huge responsibility because I was so lucky to have been born. And so I had to live this really full, rich, incredible life. And I kind of had to live 6 lives worth of experience. And that explanation, whether it's just a story or not, really helped me to see how a lot of my behavior had been about almost kind of like atoning for this like survivor's guilt and sort of trying to make sure that my life was as good as possible, as valuable as possible. But the way I think what I saw as value was just like as much experience as possible.
Yeah.
And like living life to the fullest. I realized I had been putting a lot of pressure on myself for so long. I think after the events of this book had taken place, I sort of was able to pause and go, I think I've lived a lot of life in 27, 28 years, and maybe I can sort of breathe now and like allow that it's enough and live just for myself and kind of put that to rest a bit, that kind of pressure and that need.
It's a huge amount of pressure. And I think as well, you kind of talk about the guilt to have this big life, but I think there's also with being a child, a guilt for ever being unhappy, because you know that being unhappy is the worst thing you can do to a parent. They're so worried about you all the time. And it feels,
Yeah.
I definitely have a lot of survivor's guilt of like, well, I'm still living and my brother's not. So I have to be happy and I have to be well, because otherwise it's so much pain to put my parents through all over again. But really we have to realize that living authentically or being true to ourselves is really important. And to love is to be able to like hold people when they're unhappy. But that feels very hard to do when it's like yourself.
It does. Yeah. I remember actually, because I read your novel recently, which I loved. And I think there's a bit in that where you say it's like your family are the hardest people to tell that you're unhappy because they're the people that want you to be happy the most. And I found that so relatable that I always feel like if I'm having even like just like a mildly bad day, and I tell my mother she's gonna worry and she's gonna want me to be happy. And so then you start kind of performing happiness for the people closest to you, and that just only ever creates distance, I think.
Yeah, so true. And on the other side of that pattern, when my sister says she's going through something, my natural instinct is to then try and fix it. But actually, you don't have to fix it, because it's actually quite
No.
minimize it, or like for some people, distancing. They just want to be heard, and it's okay for
Yeah,
people in your
yeah.
life to be hurt. I'm really interested to know, like, going on book tour and doing a few events, because I know your book's just come out. The cult of like wellness means so many different things, but I think what your book really captures is that need that all of us have to have answers, to have some kind of meaning for the chaos and pain that is life. And it's such an unregulated market, whether that's like people selling you retreats, guided meditations, a PDF to fix your life. Have people come to you a lot with like similar experiences? What do you feel that you've learned about this landscape, like beyond your own experience?
I haven't had that many interactions with readers yet, but I will say even on the kind of smallest scale of little things that I've done or people I've encountered or kind of met just through the publication process, how many people do feel inclined to come up to me and share things about, their relationship with the wellness industry or a family member's relationship with the wellness industry, or things about their mental health or their relationship with their therapist or revelations they had in therapy. And I think the big thing I'm realizing more and more is, what a kind of huge umbrella wellness can be. And so how many different versions of it people have encountered and people have really invested in often. And I can get very, I'm quite allergic now to the kind of language that culture uses. And I get very concerned when someone tells me, like, oh, I went to see this shaman and I took ayahuasca, or, oh, I've met this amazing healer who uses mushrooms, or, oh, I've like bought loads of crystals and I think they're speaking to me. Or, I just think I think what you say about it being unregulated is really important, because it's often positioned as quite literally medicine is a term that is used all the time. And I kind of feel like, well, medicine is very regulated. You can't sell something as actual medicine unless it's gone through a series of standards and tests and all those kind of things. And so I think people will position things often as the like ultimate answer to all kinds of problems and pain. And I just think we need to think more critically about what we're consuming and buying within that sphere. And I also think that culture itself does not really self-critique. It's always just kind of everything is inherently brilliant and pure light and pure goodness. And I don't hear that many. I don't think there's the voices of, well, actually, this was really harmful for me when I got so involved in a wellness group or a wellness practice. I feel like those voices aren't being amplified enough, because I know my experience is not the only one of this nature.
Yeah, it's not being amplified because it doesn't sell, and that's what people want. And I think as well, you're so right that anything that says it has an answer, we should all be suspicious of. Really, the important dialogues that we have is people offering more questions. And I'm really excited for the questions that your book is going to raise because it's so
Thank you.
beautiful. I'm going to come along to the party next week. How are you feeling about
Yay!
it?
I'm so excited. I keep saying it's like my wedding, and my mom doesn't like that joke very much, but I think it is. It's like my wedding to writing, and
It is.
yeah. And I'm really thrilled to have so many people from like different areas of my life in one room together, and just to celebrate this thing that I've worked on for so long, and it's now coming out into the world. It feels really special. That's great that you're going to come. It'd be nice to meet you in person.